too many people jump in, they look at the money, and they think, oh, we're going to get rich quick, and I'm just going to buy a couple $1,000 geckos and they're like swimwear, and that's not how it works. And then
Hello and welcome. My name is Bobby, and this is the very first episode of the Gecko Cove Connection, the podcast geared towards gargoyle gecko keepers. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our very first guest, Erin Ashley. Erin is the proud owner and operator of Southern Gurl Exotics in South Carolina. She has gorgeous gargoyle geckos, has been working with them for over 8 years, been breeding them for 5, and really has amped up her quality and bloodlines in the past 3. In today's episode, we'll be going over questions like, are gargoyle geckos better pets than other New Caledonian geckos? What is the general care for gargoyle geckos at each stage of their life? As well as, is social media a positive or a negative in the gargoyle gecko hobby? And lastly, is the economy as bleak with gargoyle geckos as it is with some of the other reptiles in this hobby? If that sounds interesting to you, then you're in the right place. Welcome to the Cove. All right. Well, welcome our guest, Erin Ashley. Thank you so much for being here.
thank you for having me.
Well, I'll start off with a pretty easy question. We just talked about how you've been keeping reptiles for 8 years. You've been breeding now for 5 years, and really things have amped up in the last, 3 years. So can you tell me a little bit about Southern Gurl Exotics, how you came up with the name, and just, kind of your journey from the beginning to where you are now?
Well, I'm a Florida born and bred Floridian, so Southern just fits, and I've stayed in the South. I'm in South Carolina now, and my roots are just Southern because I'm independently just womanly owned. Girl just fit in there. It was a pretty simplistic name. I'm not going to say I put a ton of thought into it. I just wanted something that kind of represented my roots, and it did. So it's just a fun name, and then of course I did a little play on words with the spelling of girl, but other than that, it wasn't fully thought out, and I didn't put a lot of thought into it. It was just a fun name I could put together. But I started getting into reptiles. Actually, we did a party. I've always been into animals. I was raised in the suburbs around animals my whole life. My parents always bought us cows and sheep and goats. We had all this crazy stuff in the suburbs. Our neighbors hated us, but my daughter had a birthday I'd done for her with the reptile keeper here in South Carolina, or critter keeper, that's who he is. And he did this amazing display. And it really it awed me as much as it awed the kids. So, you start out with like the bearded dragon and then the leopard geckos. And then your passion just grows from there. They're just incredible pets to own. And then breeding, I think, comes naturally to all of us. I think it's such a big part of getting into the hobby that I think most people at least try to breed. And so it was just something that worked for me. I enjoyed doing it. I put plans in place of what I wanted to accomplish, and then of course as my interest in different species grew, so did my desire to start breeding different species. So I've enjoyed it. I've loved it. But yeah, the last 3 years things have really amped up for me. I'm at a good place where I'm producing animals that I'm really, really proud of.
That's awesome. Well, yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. When I started down the road of reptiles, breeding was always one of those cool things where I'm like, oh, if I could actually get eggs, hatch something out. There's just something that just brought back, some of my childhood dreams, right? Either whether it was with Pokemon or other animals, just hatching something out that you've created is just, I think, draws us to that hobby. And I think a lot of us start off with that bearded dragon, right? Something easy to handle. And I think geckos are sort of taking over that introductory level, easy to handle, easy to care for lizard. And so I know we're going to talk a lot about gargoyles today, but what other animals have you kept, and what are you currently working with?
Gargoyle geckos are my main now. I started with African fat tails. I still have a few genes that I'm working with them. I did sell a lot of those just to downsize because they take a lot of space. I'm big on no matter what I'm going to breed, it's going to have efficient space. And if you have a ton of African fat tails, it's going to take up almost everything that I have for space. So I downsize, but I love them so much I'll never get rid of them. Gargoyle geckos are my other one. Crested geckos is where I started with the new Caledonia geckos. They're such a good place to start because they are so easy to breed. They're so productive. And you don't have a lot of the risk that you run with like gargoyle geckos or leechies where you have to worry about trauma or a lot of accidents during breeding. So they're a great place to start. But again, I've kind of downsized on them as well to focus more on Gargs. Leechies, I'm hoping to get them started by next year. Everybody should be full grown. I've already got a couple females that are laying duds. And then I'm hoping to branch out into some Europlatus species, some of the bigger Europlatus like Fimbriatus and the Silkeray, as well as knobtails. That is next on my list. I love knobtails. I've kept my one knobtail nipples for about 6 years now,
I love
6
that
or
name.
7 years. I love it. Well, it looks like he's got little nipples all over him. So I love that animal. I love that animal. So I am excited to branch out into them in the near future.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I know a lot of advice that I hear is to kind of stick to similar species, and just keeping with the different geckos probably makes it a little bit easier. It's so tempting to just, you want to have them all, right? But we definitely try to focus in on the quality versus the quantity. What is, where's your numbers at as far as, let's just talk about gargoyles for the moment. How many breeding pairs do you have right now? How many babies? What kind of numbers are we looking at as far as a collection?
Gargoyle geckos, as you know, can be a little finicky with breeding. First-year breeders tend to be a little finicky. I can have 5 pairs of crested geckos and get 40 eggs, and I can have 12 pairs of gargoyle geckos and only get 10 eggs for the season. So this year, I've got 12 pairs going. Some of them did great and are still laying, and then I've got a couple that gave me mostly duds, or they went bad, or they only gave me 2 clutches, or they didn't do well paired up, so I had to separate. And also Gargs, in my experience anyways, when I separate them, I may get one more fertile clutch out of them, but once I separate, they usually won't continue to lay fertile clutches like crested geckos do. As far as how many I got going, I've got 12 pairs. I don't know how many Gargs I have. If you're asking that question, I have no idea how many I own. We've got a lot. So. No,
it's okay. That the pairs help. Because right now this is my first year breeding gargoyle geckos, and I started with 3, ended up pairing one girl late, just because she started throwing duds and she was of age, and it's been really spotty. I've got one girl who's consistent. Every 60 days, she lays a beautiful clutch of eggs. The eggs do really well. Then some of my other girls, my favorite girl who I was really hoping to get a lot of eggs out of, I've gotten one fertile clutch, one clutch that looked good but went bad, and then 2 clutches that just, were absolute duds. And she's very sporadic on when she'll even lay. And so, I've got one other girl who literally has laid 1 egg. I thought she was maybe infertile. Now, they're all first-year breeders, so I'm working with all virgins here, which is frustrating. But I'm getting through it, and I'm hoping next season will be a little bit more consistent. But from what it sounds like with gargoyles, I think that's why they hold their value, is they're not as consistent and prolific as those crested geckos.
And your likelihood to produce, not many people will continue to produce fire animals every clutch, so we're just not producing as many as you see in the big traits with crested geckos. So Garg should hold their value for quite a while.
Yeah, and I'll be honest with you, I thought that they weren't as cool as crested geckos when I first saw them. And then I started to see the red base, red stripe, the blotches.
Oh, they're incredible.
And it changed me because all I saw was the brown ones. And I'm like, oh, that to me is a little mini dragon. And I fell in love. I sold off any crested gecko I had and bought into them wholesale. So definitely fallen in love there, obviously.
That's one of my favorite parts is how vibrant they are. And, gargoyle geckos will perch. A lot of the new cows hide. Gargoyle geckos will actually perch. So even if it's an animal you don't want to handle, if you put in the money to invest in a nice, colorful Garg, it's going to make an incredible display animal. Because they're right out there in the open for anybody to see. Oh, I love them. They're beautiful.
And with the reds, with crested geckos, when they fire down, it's a pink, it's all washed out. Sometimes, as they get older, they lose that anyway. Where with the gargoyles, what I love is that red, even if it washes out a little bit with age, whether it's fired up, fired down, you can see the coloration. And so I absolutely just love it. Some of my blotch girls look way better fired down than they do fired up.
Yeah, I agree.
Which I find very interesting. So,
well, you'll also learn throughout breeding that they will lose their color as they breed. So your males don't, but typically your females, a fire female that's just incredible. If you've bred her a couple seasons, 9 times out of 10, she'll start losing some of that coverage and that saturation. It's sad. I hate it, but at least I keep pictures so that everybody can know once upon a time she was amazing. So, yeah.
Exactly, and the babies are going to get that, Yeah, I've even noticed with my fully red girl, she's starting to lose her color even within the first season, but she's still so saturated that it's going to take a while to get rid of all that color. But yeah, I am noticing that for sure. Well, I really want to kind of pick your brain about how you keep your geckos. I think it's really important. We've talked a little bit about how important the hobby's husbandry is. You hear a lot of different ways to keep these geckos, and we won't get too into the weeds with breeding, but I think that kind of goes hand in hand a little bit. But so let's pretend I've never kept a gecko. This is 3 years ago. I'm just starting to get into it. If I'm buying a baby gecko from you, how do you recommend people keep them if they're just keeping them as a pet?
Well, first I'm going to say I fully believe that we can keep these animals very differently. Everybody doesn't have to have a set way to keep them. They have been bred long enough in captivity that they've evolved to be very forgiving and be a lot more diverse in how you can keep them. I personally think up to about 12 grams. You can keep them in 6 quarts. If you're getting it, which I won't sell anything that needs to be in a 6 quart. If somebody is, that's up to them. But I personally, if I'm selling a gecko, it's not going to be small enough to be kept in a 6 quart bin. But if you happen to get a hatchling or a baby that's about 12 grams or less, you absolutely can do a 6 quart bin. You could do a 12 by 12 by 12. You could do a 12 by 18 by 12. All of those I think are efficient for babies. Once they get about 15 grams to 30 grams, you can keep them in a 15-quart tub. I actually sell the converted 15-quart tubs at shows for any of my juveniles that I'm selling. I think it's a great way for people to start out when they're keeping the species because, one, you can monitor their poop, you can monitor their eating easier, you can monitor their humidity better in a smaller bin. I've heard some people say that because they're being raised in smaller bins, they think that's why they have such a hard time being little and adjusting to bigger enclosures. It kind of makes sense, but I don't know that I believe that. I think that these guys are just captive bred over decades now, and they're not used to being thrown in a big, giant 18 by 18 by 24 when they're only 5 grams. And so it can be overwhelming. So it's, again, if somebody wants to put a baby in an 18 by 24, if you give it lots of feeding places and you're not overcrowded with foliage where it's just going to lose itself in there, you can probably make it work. But I think for babies, you should start out with 6 quarts or 15 quart tubs or one of the smaller, like 12 by 18 by 12s.
Yep. And yeah, that's how I sort of started. I, came from the world with bearded dragons. And even bearded dragons, you don't want to throw them into an adult size enclosure. You start off with a 20 gallon and you work your way up, for similar reasons. But I did want to start off with something. I think I started off a little bit too big with my very first gargoyle gecko, and I learned really quickly that it was easier to maintain and watch them a little bit smaller. They grew a lot faster.
Absolutely.
But yeah, we can keep them differently. I think also the difference between a pet and breeding, not that we want to lower standards to the point where the gecko's being hurt in any way, shape, or form when you're breeding, but there is a different type of utility to things where the gecko, as long as it gets the right food and shelter and humidity, they're going to thrive and grow faster, I believe, in more, bare bones setups. Whereas, like you said, you can totally just throw a baby into a big enclosure if you're not worried about it growing fast, if you're not really trying to get it to the point where you can breed it eventually.
And if you're skilled,
So-
I mean, if you know what to look for
Yeah.
and you're skilled on what to look for, absolutely. Throw them into a big enclosure and keep your eye on them. Most first-time keepers that are asking these questions, though, they're not skilled with keeping them. They don't know what to look for.
Right.
They're constantly nervous. So I just think tubs, and I'm not big on tubs, don't get me wrong. I don't like putting adults in tubs.
Sure.
None of my adult gargoyle geckos live in the big tubs. If I run out of room, then that means I can't produce any more animals until I sell some. I like glass.
Yep.
I like PVC. I think you can decorate it more efficiently for them. I also think a lot of people come for tubs in smaller spaces out of miseducation. These animals are nocturnal, and what little bit we do know about scientifically their background is that typically in the wild, they only come out at night for a couple hours to hunt. That's usually all the movement they really have, and then they typically go back in and rest. You know, they only have a little bit of energy, even in the wild, when they're getting a little bit of UVB, to go out and hunt. So these guys aren't like migrating all over the place. They don't need miles and miles of movement. And I know that's, people use that argument for snakes and keeping them in small tubs where they're coiled 24/7, and I don't agree with that. And so it's kind of hypocritical to say that in this aspect, but it's a little different. These animals, like mine are in, these enclosures behind me are 18 by 12 by 18s, and they've got single females that are done with breeding season. And so it's deep, it's tall, it's only got a little bit of length, but still, it's perfect for them. They have plenty of room to hide, they have plenty of room to move, and it's cozy enough that they can focus on eating and resting and doing what they need to do to recover from breeding season.
Perfect. Well, okay, that leads me perfectly into my next question is, with your adults now, all right, you just explained where you keep your females singly. When you pair them up, do you pair them up one-on-one? Do you pair them up in a group? And what size enclosure do you put your breeding pairs in?
I have 18 by 18 by 30s. I also have 18 by 18 by 24s. So all of them are rep to zoo enclosures. I don't do anything more than a trio. Lots of people do. They do groups. They do 4 and 5 females to 1 male. I like to know what my lineage is, so I like to be able to tell people these eggs came from X and Y, So other people just want to do groups, that's perfectly fine. But I will not put more than a trio in an 18 by 18 by 30. And I would prefer just to do the pairs in the 18 by 18 by 24s. And I don't keep them, I know lots of people keep them year round. I keep them for about 6 months and then they separate. So that 6 months period from the time they start laying, once I get about 4 clutches, then I'll separate and they'll go into one of these 18 by 12 by 18s and they'll rest for the next 6 months until I either shelf them the next year to rest or they breed, I decide to pair them up in December again.
And you said, unlike crested geckos, if you were to just pair them up, I know some breeders recommend that you just pair them up for a few days. They'll retain sperm, and then you can potentially repair mid-season. You're saying you keep them together for the entire season and then separate them to cool.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is just my experience. Like I said, my girls will not consistently lay once they're separated. Once they're separated, I'll get maybe one more clutch out of them, and that's even if I've already got just one clutch out of them. That's not girls that have already laid 2 and 3 clutches. That's if I've gotten one clutch and I separate them, I'll usually get one more clutch if I'm lucky, and then anything after that will be infertile. And Gargs, I think, and another whole topic we won't get on, but I'm not convinced a lot of these animals are completely solitary. When I watch these animals interact and I watch them be caged up together, I'm not convinced that these animals are just completely solitary like we think they are. So personally, I kind of like when they're paired up and they have some other type enrichment and an animal, in there with them. But again, you still have to watch. You always have to watch with these animals. I mean, they are wild animals. They can get aggressive, just like us. When they've had enough, they've had enough.
Yep. And they got sharp little teeth, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Well, I mean, I agree. I see them kind of, certain pairs that I have together. I'll see them cuddled up, kind of like you see with leechies where they're in a log together and they're never really far away from each other. I mean, they snuggle more than me and my wife do. So,
Absolutely.
it's
and
one
I
of
know
those
that's
things
not a term. That's not a term people like to use with reptiles. They snuggle. I get it. They're not snuggling, but
they're not snuggling, but it's a joke.
That is they're competing for resources, and I just don't see that with these animals. It's not, for me, it's not competing with resources when they have, ledges and hides and tons of other places they could be, but they choose to be in the same location with all the same temps, all the same, So, yeah, I'm not with that argument.
Yeah. It's not like we just have one cork tube in there.
Right. So, there's
No.
more about
We're definitely
them
not
we just
saying
don't know yet.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for us to say that we know everything. There's such a newly kept species in the scheme of things. I mean, reptiles in general, we've only been keeping for, about 100 years. So, awesome. So that's how you keep your adults. I would ask, what other type of, we talked about cork tubes and potentially vines and different ledges. How would you recommend someone decorate their enclosure to really make sure that, it has an enriching life, but also it meets all of its needs?
I think the biggest thing is stop overdoing it. I see a lot of people that overdo their enclosures where, that gecko couldn't find his butthole if he tried. It's insane what I see in some of these enclosures. Let's see if you can kind of see mine, but mine are pretty basic. I like to use cork tubes, the pool noodles. I like to use these pool noodles. I think they're nice and porous. Gargs don't use their sticky pads as well as crested geckos, so anything porous is easier for them to climb on. I love the fake plants. Fake plants are easy to clean. I don't spend a ton investing in them. And then cork bark. I think cork bark is important for them to, one, have hiding spaces, but also to have other ways to climb up their enclosures, because again, they don't do well sticking on, a lot of them don't do well sticking on glass or sticking on PVC. They rely a lot more on their nails than they do just their sticky pads.
Absolutely. Yeah, I use a ton of cork bark, little bit of fake plants and things like that, but I barely ever see them climbing on the PVC or the plastic, and when I had glass enclosures, very rarely do I ever see them climb on that. Where I do find them is sometimes is the vent holes, because it's got such great grip where the screening is. My babies especially, they love just hanging out there and getting some fresh air. So, so let's talk about substrate. I know that's a big question for a lot of new keepers. And for me, it really depends on the age. So for babies, I use paper towel. I change it out pretty much every other day for them, but it's a good way to make sure that they're eating by checking for poop. It's a good way. I feed a lot of crickets to my babies, and so the crickets can't hide as easily in that. But then for my adults, I switched over to a substrate. I use cocoa chunk mixed with cocoa fiber, and that really keeps the humidity in well for me in my enclosures. And I don't use a lay box. I use just kind of that piled up in one corner. But how do you keep your geckos? What kind of substrate do you recommend, and what do you use?
I use the Zilla's Jungle Mix. It's the peat moss mix. I just think it holds moisture better. I'm not having to mist as much with this many animals. So as long as I once a week resaturate that that substrate, I tend to only need to mist once or twice a week each cage, and that helps tremendously. Like you, I keep my babies on paper towels. I have just seen horrific stories from people that are newer keepers that keep their babies on substrate. I also think we can get a little lazy with substrate, because substrate hides poop, it hides mess, it hides debris. Whereas when you have paper towels for your babies, okay, there's 2 poops in there, we got to get it cleaned, versus if there was substrate in there, you have a much higher risk of letting it kind of pollute and missing it and getting pretty nasty in there. I also saw somebody not too long ago that put all of her babies on substrate, and they all ended up with a neurological issue. They didn't hatch with a neurological issue. But she said the only thing she changed was the substrate. So I'm not sure if there was something in the substrate, maybe a fertilizer or something like that. I'm not sure what exactly caused it, but it was really weird that they didn't.
Do you know what substrate it was?
I have no idea. It looked like a cocoa fiber. This was probably about 6 months ago. It was one of the Facebook groups. I just thought it was really, really odd. One, I don't see many people do that. Not many people do substrate for their babies. But two, I thought it was odd that like there was 6 of them that all ended up with a neurological like bounce. Their heads were bouncing. It was really weird. Really weird.
Oh, that's sad. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
maybe anything that causes that to happen, we want to kind of get down to the bottom of it. But yeah, I think there's just too many pros for using just paper towel for babies, and not enough for using substrate. That may change in the future with a certain substrate that might come out where people inform each other. But for
And
right
we're
now, I
always
think
learning.
everybody's pretty much
Yeah.
in consensus there. Right.
Absolutely.
But yeah. And then your adults, you said you use your the jungle mix. I've actually used that before, but I'll be honest with you. My biggest issue is when I start digging for eggs in it. There's something in there where I have an allergic reaction to it,
Really?
and I get little splinters. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just just that sensitive. But
I
yeah.
did get a splinter a couple times when I was digging in it, so you're right about that. I have gotten splinters with it. But I just like it better than cocoa fiber. Cocoa fiber dries out.
yeah.
I've also had moldy issues. It molds a lot more with just cocoa fiber. So I've just it's worked for me. So it's one that I've liked.
Yeah. It's great. I used it for a while and just switched because of that reason. But yeah, it definitely holds humidity in like a champ. Now, do you use a lay box for your geckos, or do you just let them lay in the substrate?
They lay where they want. They all have lay boxes, but they may lay in the cork tube. And like you, I also always put like a higher corner of substrate, even with the lay box in there. Because sometimes, the lay box may dry out a little bit, or it may not be full enough for them, or it may be too full. Whatever reason they decide not to lay in it, I like them to have a separate option. And I don't know if you've noticed, but most of my girls, even if they know they have a lay box, they tend to dig in the soil first anyways. They may move over to the lay box to lay, but they always start digging in the soil first. So just to make it easier, I kind of just make sure there's a high corner in there of substrate plus the lay box, and then they all have cork tubes. Some of them lay in their cork tubes.
Yeah, I get really excited when I come in to spray at night and I see one of my girls digging right in front. Then I know something nice is going to happen that next day.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, it's awesome. So we've got the setup kind of, talked about. Do you keep a water bowl in with your geckos with that high humidity substrate, or do you just rely on the mist? Because that's something that people debate about back and forth.
Say that again, because you broke up.
Sure. So in your enclosures, do you keep a water bowl, or do you just rely on misting for the not just for the humidity, but also just for their water consumption?
I thought it was really odd the other day to see somebody say they don't use water bowls. I always use water bowls. I don't have ledges, I don't spend all that money on ledges. My water bowls and my food dishes stay on the ground, which a lot of these animals ravage in the wild on the ground for rotten food. I mean, that's a lot of the fruit they eat is the rotten foods that has fallen off trees. So it's not, foreign for them to find their food on the ground. But I thought it was very odd that somebody said that they didn't use water cups for their animals. So I guess to each their own. No, I would not want to rely just on misting. You can't guarantee they're getting enough. It seems like a lot of extra work to have to stand there for 2 and 3 minutes misting the enclosure just so each animal can drink. But to each his own. But no, I think you need to have a water dish.
Yeah, that was one of the first things that I read when keeping gargoyle geckos and crested geckos, for that matter, was just that they'll just lap up the water on the side of the glass or wherever it may be. And as soon as I'm like, you know what, I put it in with a bearded dragon. They always said that they didn't need a water bowl either, that they get their moisture from food. But I saw my bearded dragon drinking out of water, and so actually, if you see behind me here,
Right.
Going backwards with the camera. That little orange bowl there's a green one. They're just little silicone bowls, but I dump those and fill them up every single night, because if I come into my room, sometimes I just like to come in around midnight if my kid wakes me up in the middle of the night, and see where my geckos are. What are they doing? And they're usually down. I've seen them chugging water. I mean, they just... They love it, and so I've seen them use it, and I'll never not have water bowls in there. But like you said, as long as your geckos are healthy, you do what you think is best. but I've seen them use it, and I'm never going to go back to not using water bowls.
And I also think people always forget that these are captive bred animals, and they have been captive bred for decades. You know, Gargs have been around for 20, 30 years, crested geckos for like 50 years. These animals are all captive bred now. They are not used to licking water off the enclosures or leaves. That's where that comes from. They're like, oh, in the wild, they only get water off leaves. Well, if they've been born and bred in captivity for 2 decades, 3 decades, they don't drink off leaves anymore. Maybe if you have a wild-caught chameleon or a Europlatus that's wild-caught, maybe that's right. Maybe they won't drink out of a cup. But these animals, absolutely, that's what they're going to be accustomed to. These are not wild-caught animals. So I think a lot of people get on their high horse of what's right and what's wrong when they always leave out that these animals have been bred in captivity for decades. They evolve, they change.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. I don't drink out of a lake or a stream anymore. I drink out of a faucet or, or I even get my fancy, bottled water. So it's whatever you kind of grow up with. And these geckos have grown up, drinking water, hopefully out of a bowl now. No, that's awesome. Well, I think, other than we've got the enclosure kind of, mapped out, do you use a misting system or do you just use an old-fashioned pump system?
No, it would be way too expensive for me, and especially the way that my room is set up, because I can't run everything side by side. I've even got, enclosures that kind of go through the middle of the room. It would just be way too expensive for me to try to buy several misting systems, so I hand mist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I actually, I have a mister. I bought one when I first started, and I only had like 5 geckos, and it worked beautifully because they all had the same size enclosure. They were all the same age. And it made going on vacation a lot easier. But now that I'm up to about 20 geckos, and they're all different sizes and different size enclosures, I mean, I would flood the babies and barely, miss the adults. And, it's just not I actually personally love going in, misting them, seeing where they're at, physically keeping an eye on their overall health, their size, see what's changing, who's about to shed, who just shed and comes out just glowing. That's what makes this fun to me. So I totally understand putting in a misting system. There's a lot of pros, but one thing is, I don't think it's a bad thing to go check on your geckos every night that way.
No, and I think that goes into also there's several different ways to care and keep for these. The hobby is expensive. Having a hobby in reptiles is very expensive, but there's ways to cut corners that your animals aren't having to take the grunt of, but you can cut corners for yourself. And, don't get me wrong, misting systems set up with all the UVB lights. I mean, those are beautiful displays. And if you got thousands of dollars to do that, I think that's incredible. Mm-hmm. But me, no. I will hand mist. I can save myself a few $1,000s by hand misting. And if the time ever comes again that I can't continue, I'll either hire somebody or I'll have to downsize. But yeah, I like to cut corners where I can to save on cost.
Absolutely. Well, you brought up a good point, actually. I don't keep any heating or UV mist on my geckos. All I keep is actually because I'm in the north, it does get relatively cold. Not right now. We're in a little bit of a heat wave. But my house, I like to keep it around 72. And so my gecko room, I like to keep it a little bit warmer, around 77 degrees on average. So I have a space heater that fills the room, and it's all, I spent a little money to make sure that I could, change it with my phone. But do you keep any heat on your geckos? Do you just heat your room? What do you do to keep your geckos at a certain temperature?
Unless it is the middle of winter and you have severe low temperatures, I don't think anybody should put heat on their geckos. If you're not skilled in that and you're not one that can pay attention to it, these geckos are so sensitive to heat versus cold weather. They can handle cold weather fine.
Yes.
You're going to end up killing it. I don't push heat. And no, I don't use heat. I've got enough other diurnal species that need heat all day that it warms my reptile room. In the summer, my reptile room stays about 78 degrees because of like the bearded dragons, my skink, and all the other ones. And then UVB is always going to be the never decided dispute between people. I make sure that my animals get calcium with D3 each week with their feeders. And that's another thing. If I can make sure they're still getting the nutrients they need without costing them anything, then that's going to be the better way for me to keep them. So for me, as long as they're getting that D3 and that calcium, no, as of right now, I don't use UVB for my new cows either.
Okay, awesome. Well, actually, I love that segue. We're going to actually start talking about nutrition next.
Cool.
So speaking of nutrition, what's your feeding regimen? What do you feed, and what supplements do you put on that food?
Okay. One, I don't think you need to put any supplements on your crested gecko diet. Crested gecko diets are formulated to be a full diet. So these people that put bee pollen or that mix this with this and this with this, you need to be careful doing that, because some fruits and vegetables can counteract your meal replacement that you're giving your geckos. So I don't put anything additional on their actual crested gecko diet. And then babies get fed every other day. All my adults that are breeding get fed every other day. And then any adults that I have just growing out, or my juveniles that aren't breeding, they get fed about every 2 days. So I've kind of got them in different areas of the room. So I know, like, this side over here is the grow out, so they're every 2 days. And then I know this side of the room, this is babies and adults, so that's every other day, breeding adults. And then I do 1 day crested gecko diet. The next feeding will be crickets, or some of them may take super worms, whatever I've got to kind of give them a varied diet, dubias. All of those will be dusted, and then I try to fit in a second feeding of live feeders, because I personally think it's very important for them to have live feeders.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for the first year I had gargoyles, I didn't use any feeders. I just used the Pangea or Rapashi with insects. And I had some leftover heavy insect powder from Rapashi, that black soldier fly larvae powder. So I would add a little bit extra protein every so often. And they grew, but they grew relatively slow. And now I am a big believer that genetics plays a bigger part of how fast a gecko grows, even compared to the protein that they receive. But I'll talk about that later. But yeah, I've got one girl who I've never fed a single bug. She won't take them, and she's 62 grams under a year.
Right.
So to me, that's genetics. But with that, I really have started trying to feed bugs to my geckos more often. And as babies especially, they take them. I would say up until about 35, 40 grams. Mine are just ravenous for them every time I feed them, but my adults just won't touch them.
And it's an easy way to add enrichment. That's another thing that doesn't get talked about in this hobby enough, is enrichment for these animals. I mean, I don't care if you're keeping your animal in a 12 by 12 by 18. If it's getting enough enrichment, then it's going to have a fulfilled life and it's going to thrive. I don't care if you're keeping them in a 36 by 24 by 24 and giving it all the space in the world. If it doesn't have different smells and different things to explore and experience in their cage, different things to eat, it's not thriving. It's not living its natural, amazing life. So feeding feeders is a good way to add different smells in the cage, allowing these animals to do their natural instinct of hunting, as well as just having some other movement in the cage, especially if it's, something that lives by itself and isn't paired up. It's just nice to have a little bit of something for them to do that's not just sitting on a perch all day.
And they're hunters. I mean, you look at their teeth, and it's clear they are hunters. And, to watch the babies go, that's one of the best things about keeping these geckos. I posted a few videos on YouTube Shorts where they just are munching and mowing on these geckos, and you can see how excited they get. It's almost like the first time you see a leopard gecko. Now, they're so obvious because they have that tail wave. Right? And then they pounce. We don't get the tail wave with these guys, but they still have that same energy and derpiness a little bit. But no, it definitely is great enrichment. And they're not dumb animals. I think that's one thing a lot of people think that, they're not Einsteins, don't get me wrong. They're not like my dog. But I think that, they have a trust factor with you, especially with some of my babies as I'm working with them and handling. Some of them were very jumpy, and over time they are learning to trust me and trust people. And so I think the enrichment is a really big part of that.
I think the smaller the animal, the smaller the brain with reptiles, but it's also what you measure their smarts by. I mean, these animals, regardless how big their brain size are, they absolutely can adapt, they can survive, they can learn. But, no, they're not going to be cuddling with us. We're not going to be able to teach them tricks, but I think they're smart. I think that we don't give them enough credit for what they actually retain from us interacting with them.
You've said you've kept a few different species. You're keeping more than I am. For somebody who's looking at either getting a gargoyle gecko versus just a crested gecko, or maybe they're being a little more adventurous and wanting to get a lychee, from your experience, what is the simplest pitch of why a gargoyle gecko would be the pet to get? What's the major difference between them that you would steer someone towards a gargoyle?
I think it's all about preference, first off. I think what you like is what you like, and I think that's going to make a more pleasurable experience for you. Again, like we talked earlier in the episode, I love the colors of Gargs. I love how vibrant they are. But also I think a lot of people, because they're not experienced with them, don't realize that for me, I think they're a lot more handleable than crested geckos. Once they're adults, they don't tend to be as flighty. Now you can get bit, but I've only gotten bit one time, and that was by a juvenile. My daughter gets bit all the time, but she also moves real fast when she's around them. So naturally, they just get spooked and they'll bite. But I mean, I've not had the experience of them be aggressive. Overall, I think they make a much more easier pet and more tolerant to handling pet than even crested geckos. But like I said, you do run the risk. They do have sharp teeth, and they do occasionally bite if you spook them. However, it doesn't hurt. They typically don't latch on, and then they make awesome displays. I mean, even if you wanted to not handle it, which they're fine. These animals are fine if you don't want to handle them. I see people all the time, I'm rehoming my reptile because I just don't have time to handle it. You probably have the happiest reptile in the world if you're not handling it. So keep it.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, especially if you just want a beautiful animal that you can do an amazing, cage for and set up. These animals are perfect because they will perch out in the open, and they are going to be showstoppers. People are going to walk by that cage, and they're going to see this beautiful red or vibrant orange animal, and they're going to stop. They do it all the time when I bring kids or I bring my friends in my reptile rooms. They always stop at the best-looking ones. So I love,
absolutely.
I love Gargs. They're just my favorite.
I love that you said that they're more handleable because, again, every gecko is an individual. I've got some jumpier geckos. I've got some that are just, they're better than bearded dragons as far as handling, right? I can put them on my shoulder and she'll just hang out. But with that, I've had a few crested geckos over the years. Now I don't have them anymore. And just the number of crested geckos I've tried to handle, especially, even adults, they're a little bit more spastic. They're definitely more jumpy. Yeah. They're a little bit more frayed. And, there's nothing wrong with that. There's some that are just absolute, potatoes as well. But I would say overall, that's one thing I've noticed and why I really like them. And, I've never been bitten by any of my gargoyles or any gargoyle that I've ever handled or had.
Right.
Maybe it's because I just know what I'm doing and I'm going a little bit slower with them. But I also, I've got two little kids under 5 years old. And my 2-year-old every morning wakes up and goes, "Daddy, gecko?" He wants to go and he checks on the geckos. It's the cutest thing. I got to record it. But, I'm teaching him just go slow, pet the back. And I think that if you educate people on how to handle these animals, the chances of getting bit are very, very low, So, again, every gecko is an individual, but I really don't think my kids are in any danger whatsoever.
No, they're not. They're an incredible species. And like I said, it's not like a lychee bite. So if it did bite you or if it did bite your kid, it may draw a little tiny prick of blood, but it's not going to hurt anybody. And again, like you said, I also think this also plays into how smart these animals are. If you're going to be more timid when you go to handle them and you're more jerky and you're afraid of them, you're spooking them. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So I think that plays too in the type that you pick. You know, if you feel more comfortable with crested geckos, go with crested geckos. You'll probably have a better experience. If you feel more comfortable with Gargs, then go with Gargs or work up to it. You know, with lychees, I had my first one for 4 years and I thought, I'm never getting another one. I can't handle her. We nickname her Bee Face because she is an absolute bee. And I mean, if I walk by, she'll tag the glass trying to hit me in the head. And I'm like, I'm never going to get another one. And I'm so glad that I decided, okay, let me try a couple different ones and personalities, because they're amazing when you find that right one that you've worked with. They enjoy you, they tolerate you, you enjoy them. They're amazing. So Gargs are the same way. I think that if you're intimidated by them, you're never going to get over that until you start handling them and realize, okay, I can predict its behavior. It's not going to bite me. It's not going to maul me. I'm going to be okay. And it's incredible. So, yeah. I just love everything about Gargs.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit easier with Gargs to get over your fear than with lychees, I think. But once you find a really nice lychee, there's one at one of the local shows I go to that one of the breeders that I'm going to bring on later on, Ariel, he always has a giant GT gargoyle, and that thing is just a big puppy dog. So, they can be absolutely fantastic as well.
Right.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about how to keep them, enclosures, and kind of the nuances of how you keep your geckos. But I really know you through social media. This is the first time we've actually interacted sort of digitally face-to-face and talked.
Right.
And so I really appreciate you being on. But
Absolutely.
you know, social media has been such a big part of my journey through gargoyle geckos. Can you tell me a little bit about how you utilize social media to bring the community together, and also just how you use it to make your hobby even more fruitful?
Well, I am working on my social media presence. I just year before last, 2 years now, started a Facebook one. I've had Instagram for several years. I'm in my early 40s, so producing content and being like all exciting and coming up with all these cool ideas that people want to watch, I'm new to that. So I've started trying to get more comfortable by doing like little educational 1-minute reels on my social media, mainly Instagram. I like Instagram a lot better than I like Facebook. Facebook tends to bring out a lot of drama in the groups and all that. So I really like Instagram a lot better. But, I'm starting a YouTube channel, which I may, after this podcast, need your help because I cannot get this video uploaded. It has been trying for 24 hours. So anyways, but I
can definitely help you with that. We'll talk.
Thank you so much. But I am trying to branch out there a little bit more. I think social media is a great tool, and especially for the younger generation that's coming into the hobby. I just hate that it gets sometimes it gets into the who's cool, who's popular, who's nastier. I don't like that part of the social media in our industry.
Right.
But there's so much education stuff out there for you to learn. There's so many great breeders. That's another thing I love about the Garg community. Like I said, I breed several different species, and one of the reasons I've kind of stepped back from crested geckos is I don't like the communities. I don't like the way they treat each other and carry on among themselves. But the Garg community has been welcoming since the day I bought my first Garg. Every breeder I've done business with, I have an amazing friendship with. Everybody I've met that produces Gargs or just keeps Gargs that's on my social media, we have an amazing interaction, positive interaction. So there's different sub-communities within our community.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. And it's weird because it's like different people are attracted to different species. So yeah, but Garg,
I haven't had a bad
community
experience yet. Yeah, I've really, I found you obviously through just seeing some of your posts and some of your amazing geckos that make me drool a little bit and jealous.
Thank you.
And I definitely want to get one day. But you're right. I mean, I've reached out to so many different gargoyle breeders just to ask questions, to ask, what do you have? Because I know some of the best geckos when you're buying them, and I was in buying mode for the last 2 years, are not always posted on Morph Market. Some of them are kept back a little bit. And, people are more than willing to share what they have and be honest and talk about pricing and talk about, the care of them one-on-one. And I mean, I couldn't be where I am today without the social media influence of just the connection. Otherwise, I wouldn't know where to go to be honest with you.
I agree
So
with you.
Facebook and Instagram have
agree
definitely helped. YouTube is I think lacking with the gargoyle community, and that's what I'm trying to improve a little bit with this podcast, but
which
also
we talked
with my
about
YouTube
this.
channel.
Yes.
Yeah.
I am very excited that you're doing a podcast directed towards gargoyle geckos. I really like the Gecko Pod podcast, but it does still very much center around crested geckos. So I love that this is going to be one centered around gargoyle geckos, but also it's going to open up the industry to start having more education out there, more resources. Because I think once we start highlighting these animals more and we start making podcasts that are fun to listen to and to learn about these animals, I think their popularity is just going to keep skyrocketing. So I love that you're doing this.
That's what I'm hoping.
And I think that Garg breeders, they just don't get as recognized yet, and there are some amazing gargoyle Gecko breeders, and not just by what they're producing, I mean by their personalities, what they've contributed to the hobby. All around, I'm stoked about your podcast, and social media, I'm hoping, is going to continue to bring Gargs and Garg breeders to the spotlight, because they deserve it. A lot of them do.
Yeah, and I agree with you that, I think I would be lying if I didn't say the Gecko Pod was a little bit of an inspiration for this.
Right.
And this is not to compete with the Gecko Pod.
No,
this is
that's
just
amazing.
to emphasize Gargs a little bit more. And so I'd love to collaborate with them if you're listening. But with that being said, I agree with you. I don't know if you put it on or if it was a collaboration with others, but the giveaway earlier this year for a lot of gargoyles and just to recognize a lot of the gargoyle breeders. Do you know what I'm talking about from earlier this year?
Yeah.
So I thought.
Juliana's Geckos,
That was amazing.
Nicoletta at Juliana's Geckos, she had done some breeder showcases years prior that I had seen, and I thought, this is amazing, of course, and she brought in a bunch of different species. It was crested gecko breeders, a couple Garg breeders, a couple lychee breeders, and I thought, this is amazing. And like I said, this last 3 years have just been really good. My connections have, solidified. I've made some great friends, and I really kind of felt, especially women, I kind of feel like this is still a male-dominated hobby. So I think that even the women that get a lot of followers, you still don't hear a lot of people speaking their names and their brands. When people are like, where do you get your Gargs from? They still aren't speaking about the women, even though these women have like 10 and 15,000 followers because they're such amazing Garg breeders. I decided with the economy.
It's actually funny you say that too, because I'll be honest with you. When I think of like the biggest gargoyle breeders that I've reached out to and I want their geckos, almost all of them are women. Almost all of them. And so, they deserve some recognition. You guys are doing amazing stuff.
Absolutely. And most of us are single moms. A lot of these women are single parents that, they're coming up with this funding and all this by themselves, the time to come up with all of this and to handle and care for all of this while we're also taking care of our kids and everything else. It was just an idea. I didn't even know if anybody would want to do it, so I just sent it out to about 10 of my favorite people that I had really connected with over the last few years, and every one of them were just excited. There was a few, I had a couple cresty breeders in there, but most of them weren't interested, so it kind of turned into a Garg thing all by itself. But that was great. I ran with it. It was an amazing event for the community at the time because the market was slow. Nobody was buying things. But it gave people a lot of excitement about, okay, well, we can still get animals even though right now we're all on tough times and can't afford to pay $2,000 for a gargoyle gecko right now. It was fun. And I don't know. For me, I will definitely be doing one again. I'm hoping around Christmas. It was a great event, and I'm glad that I did it, and I'm so grateful to everybody that did it with me.
Well, let me know if you're going to do it again. I'd love to be a part of it this next time around.
I'd love to have you.
And the funny thing is you watch, when I put in for every single gargoyle. I didn't win anything, spoiler alert, but I was so close. There was literally, I think there was... Yes,
it was
yours
mine.
was one.
Remember? Yes, it was the circle one. It stopped, and then it went right to the next name. Yes,
one next one. I was like, oh, gosh. But you know what's funny? So you were the first one, and then Red Rack, right? He had his, and my name was... The same thing happened. It was one away, and he messaged me. He's like, I was this close to saying your name, and then it just switched over. And I'm like, of course, two in one night. My wife's like, oh, what are you doing? Why are you complaining? I'm like, because I almost won 2 geckos. Like, you don't know how exciting this would have been. So, just that added excitement and community. And again, if you win, great. If you didn't win, it was still fun. I reached out to people I had never talked to before. And thank you for putting that on. That to me is just a demonstration of the fun that we're having in this hobby.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that.
What it was
and let me know when you're doing it.
I will.
Awesome.
I will. I'd love to have you on. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, as long as I can get these guys to produce enough where I can give one away, but I definitely will. I'll find a way, one way or another. So,
well, you can do gift certificates too.
Yeah, I could.
Yeah.
I want to give a gecko away. I think it'd be fun.
I know people get more excited about that. Absolutely.
They do.
But either way, the purpose is to both reward the community as well as bring some advertising and some recognition to the breeders. So beggars can't be choosy. So some of us do gift certificates, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's all right. No, we love anything that gives back. And one other little fun story about that is that so many people, maybe it was just the way I was posting them and reposting some of the geckos that were being given up or being given away. But people thought I was giving away. People in my family would be like, are you giving away geckos already? Are you doing a giveaway? And I'm like, no. Those aren't mine. I'm trying to win them. And I had a lot of really prominent people and even people across the sea reach out to me because I posted one. It was post your favorite gecko of Cosmic Exotics collection, right? And I picked one of her super ultra blotches and I posted it. I had so many people go, that is the best gecko ever. Oh my God, I can't believe you have that. Where did you get it? I go, it's not mine.
Paige is amazing.
So
the animals that Paige produces, they're incredible. And Paige is Paige, BH Exotics, and Burgess. All 3 of those ladies, well, 4 because BH is 2 ladies, but all 4 of those women are huge inspirations for me. They've been around longer than me. A lot of my breeders come from their lines. Actually, I don't have anything yet from Paige.
Awesome.
So we'll probably be trading here soon in the future. But they're all inspiring women in the hobby. They are good women. They are great breeders. Their care and husbandry, I mean, everything about them are amazing. But Paige she is killing it over there with her gargoyle geckos.
Oh, she is. I before I even started purchasing, I studied her lines, and I love her website that it goes back lineage-wise, and so I want to keep my lineage just like you guys are doing. I think it's really important. But
I think it is too.
I think we're oh, definitely, especially with only 2 different morphs, especially kind of narrowing down. I don't want to get into the weeds with morphs right now, just for time's sake, but. I do want to say thank you so much for your time. I know we were about an hour into this. All right. So to round us out for the day, I really appreciate your time. I kind of want to ask about the overall economy right now. I know that's a big hot topic. So what is your take on the gecko economy, especially with gargoyles? And what advice would you give a person just looking to get into gargoyles as maybe a hobby or as a business?
Well, as far as the market's concerned, I think it's all about perception. I think if you are one of the smaller breeders like myself, you can really use this opportunity to start focusing on other avenues. One, to generate income in the hobby, and as well as build your brand, like social media, the YouTube channel I'm starting, etc. If you are somebody that only has this as an income, it's probably a little more stressful for you where the market's at. However, the market will stabilize. People got very spoiled with the COVID checks. Everything was marked up because so many people had money to throw at those high prices. Well, now oversaturation, everything's gone up, from groceries to gas to mortgages to etc. So it's going to have a trickle effect on everything, but it will stabilize. It's already starting to stabilize. We're starting to see a few more sales. We're starting to see the prices go up a little bit. So it's not a horrible thing like everybody's making it out, and we need to stop fear selling where everybody's like, oh, I got to get out of it. I'm going to sell everything for dirt cheap, because you're killing us. You're killing everybody else. And as far as
do you see that as much with the gargoyles?
I don't.
Do you see that as much with the gargoyles?
Gargoyle geckos are not... Gargoyles, they just don't sell as quick as crested geckos, just because the demand is never. as high as what crested geckos are, because they're not promoted as well. They're just not as known. Even though they're very popular, they're not as popular. But you also, again, like we talked earlier, you're just not going to produce non-stop high-end animals. You know what I mean? So typically what you'll see is the ones that are killer are going to go for $4,000 and $5,000, and 9 times out of 10, first-time keepers and even just hobbyists aren't going to spend that money. Other breeders are our best friends. Other breeders are the ones that are going to spend the $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 on a high-end Garg. So the market will be fine. As far as breeding, right now, I never advocate for anybody to jump into breeding, because that's what I did. And I didn't even know how to do a punt knit square. I had no business breeding these animals when I had no idea what I was doing. So I don't really push it, but yeah, I think that if you're going to keep an animal for a year or more and really be responsible in learning its behaviors and its needs and its care requirements, and then you want to go into breeding something, I'm always open to help somebody, and there's a lot of people out there in the community that will help you. I just think people need to, if you're going to take advantage of the market right now, you need to do it slow. Get you one pair if you're just going to dive in there. Do it slow. Get familiar with it. But yeah, to each their own. We're never going to stop people from jumping in and breeding. I don't know why it goes hand in hand. It did for me. It did for you. It just does for some reason with these animals, probably because they're so easy to keep. The community promotes it so much. I don't know. So we're never going to stop it, but we can at least try to promote more responsible breeding, a little, slower start instead of mass producing junk animals that flood the market. So, I mean, just be responsible about it. If that's what you want to do, I did it. I can't really tell anybody, it's the wrong thing to do, but you need to be responsible and you need to put the animals first, whatever you do. So make sure you're dotting all your T's and I's and crossing all your T's, because, I mean, it gets expensive. You put a lot more money into these animals before you'll ever see a return on them.
Absolutely. I mean, start slow. I completely agree with that message. I started with just 3, and taking care of it versus taking care of 20. It doesn't seem like that big of a jump. I know there are some keepers where you hear they have 200-300 geckos breeding pairs, and I don't know how they handle it. To be perfectly honest, I think that it's awesome they do, but to me that's a full-time job. I know there are some nights I come in here doing my nightly routine, and just to go, I fell asleep on the couch. Do I really have to go spray the geckos tonight? Yeah, I got to go spray the geckos. So being the kind of person that's willing to put in the day in and day out, even though they're easy to keep, they still require care on a very consistent, and consistency is the big word, basis. So, Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. I'm so glad you said yes. You were one of my first people I reached out to.
Me. I'm stoked. Thank you so much. This has been so fun.
Yes. Well, we'll have to do it again sometime down the line. You are my very first guest, so thank you so much, and I will always remember this. Again, for everybody listening, please, if you like this, encourage us to do a little bit more. Like, subscribe, do all that Facebook mumbo jumbo.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Hey, if you've enjoyed this video and want to encourage me to make more Gargoyle Gecko content, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, share this with a friend, and maybe check out one of the videos right over there. I'll see you next time on Gecko Cove.